I am Harrison, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful logistics company founder, I escaped my harsh beginnings, but maintained contact and provided everything for my son. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between expensive champagne and caviar, my son leaned forward smirking. "You know, Dad, you are lucky we even include you in the business now. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night I logged in, disabled every corporate credit account they had, and emailed my lawyer about executing the blind trust. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Chicago meant hard work to outsiders. But inside our sprawling suburban home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 6-bedroom house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations my son could never quite meet, leading to a greed that poisoned him. I told my son I was exhausted and going to bed early. I just needed some rest after a long day of physical therapy. But later that night, I heard the heavy oak floorboards of his hallway creak. Through the narrow slit of my half-closed eyes, I watched my own flesh and blood rifle through my belongings in the dark. He stood over my chair, breathing heavily, and slipped something solid into the pocket of my wool coat. He stepped back into the hallway, pulling out his phone. "It is done," he whispered into the receiver. "Call the police tomorrow morning." I lay frozen in that guest bedroom, the silence of the house pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I did not spend 40 years of my life building Caldwell Freight and Logistics from a single rusted delivery van into a multi-state empire with a fleet of 500 trucks, just to end up terrified in my own son's home. I was only staying with Derek and his wife Melanie for a few weeks to recover from a minor knee surgery. They had insisted. They told me I needed to rest, that I needed family looking after me since my beautiful wife passed away 4 years ago. I thought it was a genuine gesture of love. I thought I had raised a good, honest man who respected the legacy I was preparing to hand over to him. But as the taillights of Derek's car swept across my bedroom wall and his engine faded down the suburban street, the cold, bitter truth washed over me. You do not survive 40 years in the cutthroat logistics business without learning how to read people. You do not negotiate with ruthless competitors, manage thousands of employees, and build an $80 million company by being naive or turning a blind eye to danger. I threw off the heavy quilt, completely ignoring the sharp shooting pain radiating from my surgically repaired knee. I forced myself upright, leaning heavily against the nightstand for balance. I limped over to the armchair, where I had draped my heavy wool coat earlier that evening. This was the exact same coat I wore 15 years ago when I proudly rang the opening bell at the stock exchange, a symbol of all my hard work. Now it was being used as a staging ground for a betrayal I could barely comprehend. I reached my trembling hand into the deep side pocket. My fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. I pulled out a small, unmarked black USB drive. Beside it was a cheap, prepaid burner phone. The kind of phone criminals use when they absolutely do not want to leave a paper trail. I stared at the two objects resting in my wrinkled palms, the pale moonlight from the window casting long shadows across my hands. The words I had just heard Derek whisper echoed endlessly in my mind. Call the police tomorrow morning. My own son was setting me up. He was planting evidence on me while I slept under his roof. If the police were coming tomorrow, they were coming to find exactly what he had just dropped into my pocket. My mind raced through 100 different terrifying possibilities. What could possibly be on that flash drive? Offshore tax fraud documents, evidence of massive corporate embezzlement, illegal shipping manifests. Whatever it was meticulously designed to ruin me, to lock me away in a federal cell and remove me from the company permanently. Panic tried to take hold of me, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead, but I forced the fear down into the pit of my stomach. I needed a plan, and I needed it immediately. I limped over to my leather travel bag, tearing through the zippers until I found my personal electronics case. I am a creature of habit. I always carry my classic jazz music collection on a handful of generic black USB drives to listen to in the car. I dumped them onto the mattress. I frantically sorted through them until I found one that looked nearly identical to the drive Derek had planted. It had the same matte black finish, the same cheap plastic casing, even the same tiny silver loop at the end. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I made the swap. I placed the drive containing my harmless music files back into the pocket of my wool coat. Now I needed a secure place to hide the real drive and the burner phone. If the police came with a warrant, they would tear through my bags. They would search every inch of the guest room, but they would not search the medical equipment strapped directly to my injured body. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully unfastened the thick Velcro straps of my bulky medical walking boot. The pain in my knee flared, but pure adrenaline numbed it. I slid the real USB drive and the prepaid phone deep into the thick padded lining near my ankle, ensuring they were completely concealed and secure before strapping the heavy boot tightly back onto my leg. I crawled back into bed fully dressed, under the covers, my heart pounding a relentless rhythm against my chest. I did not sleep a single second that night. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose expensive college tuition I paid in full. Without a second thought, the man I had recently promoted to chief operating officer of my life's work could commit such an atrocity. I thought about the luxurious life he and Melanie lived, the expensive imported cars in their driveway, the lavish vacations they took every summer. Had my generosity created a monster? Had my desire to provide a good life funded my own executioner? The hours crawled by in agonizing slow motion. Every shadow in the room felt like a looming threat. Every creak of the house settling sounded like a footstep approaching my door. I kept waiting for the sun to rise, praying that maybe I had misunderstood, that maybe my old ears were playing cruel tricks on me. But deep down, my seasoned gut told me the devastating truth. The war for my life and my legacy had already begun, and I was entirely alone behind enemy lines. At exactly 6 in the morning, the harsh reality of my nightmare arrived. The soft, quiet morning darkness was violently shattered by the strobing flash of blue and red lights cutting sharply through the blinds of my bedroom window. I heard the sudden screech of heavy tires on the driveway pavement, followed immediately by the synchronized thud of car doors slamming shut. Heavy, authoritative fists began pounding relentlessly on the front door downstairs, a sound so aggressive and loud it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I sat up, gripping the edge of the mattress as a deep voice boomed from the porch, echoing through the quiet suburban street. "Open up. Police. We have a search warrant." To complete this 20,000-word narrative, the remainder of the story follows a strict chronological outline. Each subsequent scene is precisely allocated 1,200 words to maintain a relentless driving pace. The heavy wooden front door downstairs did not just open. It was violently breached with a resounding crack that vibrated through the floorboards and shot straight up into the soles of my feet. Heavy synchronized footsteps swarmed the entryway, creating a chaotic symphony of tactical boots and shouting voices that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of my son's pristine suburban home. I remained sitting quietly on the edge of the guest bed, gripping the white cotton sheets tightly, forcing my breathing to slow to a measured pace. I had to play the part perfectly. I was supposed to be a frail 70-year-old man recovering from a painful knee surgery, violently and unexpectedly awakened from a deep, peaceful sleep. I rubbed my eyes slowly, letting a calculated tremor take hold of my hands as the heavy footsteps aggressively climbed the oak staircase and thundered down the hallway directly toward my door. The bedroom door swung open with terrifying force, hitting the plaster wall with a sharp, echoing thud. 3 federal agents poured into the room immediately, their bright flashlights piercing the dim gray morning shadows. They moved with absolute military precision, their faces rigid and unyielding. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern jawline and a dark blue windbreaker, bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI, stepped forward into the center of the room. He held up a thickly folded document, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. He stated clearly that they were executing a federal search warrant. He looked directly into my eyes and read the formal charges aloud without blinking. The heavy words hung in the cold air like a toxic fog. They were aggressively searching for concrete evidence of massive offshore tax evasion, highly sophisticated wire fraud, and severe corporate embezzlement, all tied directly to the personal and professional financial accounts of Harrison Caldwell. My name, the very name I had spent 4 decades keeping absolutely spotless and highly respected in the industry. I let my mouth fall open in perfectly feigned shock, shaking my head weakly from side to side. But my mind was silently spinning like a finely tuned engine calculating every single variable. The agents did not wait for any sort of response or explanation from me. They immediately began tearing the guest room apart with methodical ruthlessness. They flipped the heavy mattress, violently emptied the carefully packed contents of my leather travel bag onto the hardwood floor, and swept thoroughly through the small closet space. I watched them in complete silence, expertly maintaining my outer facade of terrified elderly confusion. Then the lead agent moved purposefully toward the armchair in the corner of the room. He reached his gloved hands out for my heavy wool coat. A sharp, burning pang of genuine anger flared deep in my chest. That coat was not just a piece of ordinary clothing. It was a tangible, precious piece of my personal history. I wore that exact wool coat on a crisp November morning, 15 years ago, when I proudly stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange and proudly rang the opening bell. It was the crowning achievement of my entire life, the unforgettable moment I took Caldwell Freight and Logistics completely public, transforming a humble, struggling fleet of delivery vans into a dominant, publicly traded corporate empire. It was a coat that deeply symbolized honest, grueling labor and countless sleepless nights. And now it was being roughly handled by federal agents, completely desecrated by the very betrayal my own flesh and blood had orchestrated in the dark. Watching them meticulously search the deep pockets, the sheer breathtaking scale of the trap finally crystallized entirely in my mind. Derek was not merely stealing company money to quickly cover his hidden debts. He was meticulously orchestrating an absolute masterclass in financial deception. He was purposely framing me for the systematic destruction of the empire I had literally bled to build. He fully intended to stand back and watch me take the devastating fall, forcing me to bear the full weight of federal prison while he walked away completely clean, wearing the untouchable mask of a grieving, perfectly innocent son who had lost his father to greed. The lead agent plunged his gloved hand deep into the right side pocket of the heavy wool coat. I consciously held my breath, letting my shoulders slump forward slightly, as if the mounting fear was physically breaking my spirit. He pulled his hand out slowly, and between his thick fingers rested the small, unmarked black USB drive. It was the dummy drive, the exact physical duplicate I had swapped in the pitch-black dark just a few hours ago, containing absolutely nothing but thousands of harmless jazz music files. But the federal agent did not know that crucial detail. I watched his stern, unyielding face light up instantly with a grim, highly victorious satisfaction. He turned to his colleagues, nodding sharply and confidently. He held the small piece of plastic high up in the morning light, treating it as if he had just miraculously captured the holy grail of corporate crime. He quickly pulled a clear plastic evidence bag from his jacket pocket, dropped the drive inside, and sealed it securely with a loud, definitive zip. He firmly declared it as Exhibit A, instructing the other agent to log it immediately for the highly specialized cyber forensics team. I deliberately kept my eyes wide and my hands shaking visibly, playing the deeply broken old man to absolute undeniable perfection. Inside, however, a cold, fiercely burning rush of triumph surged rapidly through my veins. The real dangerous evidence, the damning digital paper trail, and the untraceable burner phone was safely tucked away, digging sharply but incredibly reassuringly into my ankle inside the thick padding of my medical boot. They had completely taken the carefully laid bait, entirely unaware that the vulnerable prey they firmly thought they had successfully cornered was actually the apex predator silently setting the ultimate trap. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted violently in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. Frantic, heavy footsteps sprinted loudly across the hardwood floor. Derek abruptly burst into the bedroom, his face a flawless, highly theatrical mask of sheer horror and desperate confusion. His hair was perfectly disheveled, his eyes widened with fake, believable panic. He aggressively pushed past a uniformed police officer, completely ignoring their strict commands to stand back, and positioned his body directly and forcefully between me and the lead FBI agent. He raised his hands defensively, his chest heaving dramatically, as he played the difficult role of the devoted, fiercely protective son to absolute perfection. His voice trembled with an expertly crafted mixture of deep fear and righteous anger as he looked fiercely at the federal agents standing in the room. "There must be a massive, terrible mistake," he shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, crowded room. "My father is a good, honest man, and you have no right to treat him this way." The lead agent stared at my son for a long, cold, calculating moment. He did not offer sympathy, nor did he argue. He simply recorded Derek's outburst in his notebook and signaled for his team to wrap up the search. The flashing blue and red lights finally ceased sweeping across the bedroom walls as the federal agents filed out through the shattered front door, taking the sealed plastic evidence bag safely with them. The heavy silence that immediately descended upon the empty house was absolutely deafening. It was the specific kind of thick, suffocating quiet that always follows a devastating, natural disaster. I remained sitting frozen on the edge of the ruined mattress, letting my breathing stay intentionally shallow and completely erratic. My aching chest heaved with carefully orchestrated panic. I silently watched the tiny gray dust motes blindly dance in the bright morning light that now poured freely through the torn blinds. Derek rushed to my side, kneeling quickly on the cold, hardwood floor. He placed his hands gently on my trembling knees, his face a perfect canvas of deep concern and overwhelming filial devotion. He helped me stand up, wrapping his strong arm firmly around my waist to support my weight as I leaned heavily onto my wooden cane. We walked slowly down the hallway and descended the grand oak staircase step by agonizing step. Every single movement caused the hidden burner phone inside my medical boot to press firmly against my ankle. It was a sharp, grounding reminder of reality amidst this masterful illusion. We entered the massive, pristine kitchen. Melanie was already waiting there. She wore a plush silk robe, her hair tied back carelessly, to give the impression of a woman deeply shaken from a peaceful sleep. She hurried over her flawless face, painted with a look of profound, agonizing pity. She pulled out a tall chair at the marble island and guided me into it with exaggerated, theatrical care. She quickly poured a glass of iced water, her manicured fingers trembling just enough to make her performance incredibly believable. She set the heavy glass directly in front of me and placed a comforting, warm hand on my shoulder, sighing softly into the quiet room. Derek pulled up a matching chair directly across from me. He leaned forward and took both of my wrinkled hands in his own. His grip was exceptionally tight, projecting false strength and unwavering reassurance. He looked me straight in the eyes, his brow furrowed with deep, manufactured sorrow. "Dad," he began, his voice barely above a raspy, emotional whisper. "The feds think millions of dollars are missing from the corporate holding accounts. They think someone has been moving massive amounts of capital offshore to evade federal income taxes." I let out a sharp gasp, pulling my hands back slightly, as if the very words burned me. Derek held on tighter, leaning closer. "I need you to be completely honest with me, Dad. Your memory has not been great lately, not since Mom passed away. You have been so tired, so deeply overwhelmed by the terrible grief. Is it possible you signed something you did not fully understand? Did one of the external accountants trick you into authorizing transfers while you were distracted?" The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was weaponizing the tragic death of my beloved wife to construct a plausible narrative for his own crimes. He was laying the groundwork to declare me mentally unfit, a confused, grieving widower who had blindly signed away his empire to opportunistic predators. I could see the cold, calculating gears turning behind his warm, sympathetic eyes. He was testing my lucidity, probing to see exactly how much of his fabricated reality I was willing to blindly swallow. "Do not worry about the company," he continued smoothly, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "I am going to step up. I will take an immediate leave of absence from my operational duties to personally manage your legal defense. I will hire the best federal attorneys in Chicago. I will handle the board of directors and the press. You just need to rest and let me protect you. I will not let them put you in a cage, Dad. I promise you." It took every ounce of my formidable willpower not to reach across that marble island and wrap my hands around his throat. I had spent my entire life protecting this boy, providing for him, teaching him the value of an honest day of grueling work. And here he was, sitting in a house funded by my sweat, calmly explaining how he was going to strip me of my dignity and my freedom under the guise of familial love. I forced tears to pool in my eyes. I let my lower lip quiver uncontrollably. I slumped forward, breaking my posture entirely, burying my face in my hands. "Oh God!" "Derek," I sobbed, letting my voice crack with genuine-sounding despair. "I do not know. I cannot remember. The paperwork is always so endless, and my mind has been so clouded since your mother left us. I was so tired. What if I made a terrible mistake?" I looked up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "I am so scared, son. I am so terribly scared." Derek squeezed my hands again, a microscopic flash of absolute triumph crossing his pupils. "I know, Dad. I know you are scared. But you have me. You have Melanie. We are going to get through this nightmare together. You just have to trust me completely. Let me handle all the bank authorizations from now on." I nodded vigorously, wiping the fake tears from my wrinkled cheeks. I whispered my endless gratitude, praising him for being the strong, dependable son I always prayed he would become. I pushed myself up from the table, leaning my weight onto my cane. I told them I needed to lie down, that the shock had drained whatever energy I had left. Derek offered to help me up the stairs, but I waved him off weakly, insisting I just needed to move slowly and find some quiet isolation. I hobbled out of the kitchen, dragging my booted foot heavily against the polished hardwood floor. As I turned the corner into the long hallway leading to the staircase, I paused for just a fraction of a second. A large, ornate antique mirror hung perfectly positioned on the wall, giving me a clear, unobstructed view back into the kitchen. I shifted my gaze to the reflective glass. Derek dropped his mask of sorrow instantly. He was standing perfectly straight, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. Beside him, Melanie was no longer acting the part of the distraught, pitying daughter-in-law. The fake sadness had completely vanished from her face. She looked directly at her husband with a cold, predatory smirk. Slowly, she raised her hand and gave Derek a subtle, victorious thumbs up. I turned away from the mirror. I dragged my booted foot across the carpet, making certain every step sounded defeated. Once inside the guest bedroom, I pushed the door shut and turned the solid brass lock with a definitive click. The moment the latch engaged, the illusion of the frail, terrified old man completely vanished. I stood straight, ignoring the persistent throb radiating from my operated knee, and walked purposefully toward my travel bag, sitting in the corner. I reached deep inside the hidden lining at the bottom of the bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. It was an extremely secure military-grade device that I specifically used for handling confidential corporate acquisitions, a machine intentionally designed to remain completely invisible and untraceable to the main company network. I carried the heavy device over to the small desk by the window. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and immediately began to unstrap the thick medical boot encasing my lower leg. I ripped the heavy Velcro straps apart one by one. Reaching deep into the dense foam padding near my ankle, I retrieved the real unmarked black USB drive and the cheap prepaid burner phone. I set the phone down on the nightstand beside the lamp. Then I held the small black drive in the center of my palm, staring at it for a long, quiet moment. This tiny piece of plastic was the exact weapon my own flesh and blood fully intended to use to bury me alive in a federal penitentiary. I plugged the drive into the side port of my laptop. The machine demanded authorization. I typed in my 30-character decryption password. The dark screen blinked twice before suddenly loading a massive series of deeply nested financial folders. I am a man who built a nationwide logistics empire from scratch, starting with nothing but a single rusty delivery van. In the freight and shipping business, your survival dictates that you must know exactly where every microcent of your capital goes at any given moment. You must track microscopic fuel consumption variations across thousands of highway miles. You must constantly monitor interstate toll tariffs. You must calculate the depreciation on hundreds of expensive diesel engines running around the clock. Over 4 decades of grueling work, my brain became hardwired to spot even the slightest financial anomalies, to see the invisible leaks hiding within a complex corporate structure. Derek knew this trait about me better than anyone else in the world. He knew that I would eventually notice the missing capital draining from our accounts. That is exactly why he did not steal the money and run away. Instead, he constructed an elaborate alternate reality where I was the sole architect of my own company's systematic destruction. I opened the first digital folder, which was labeled only with a long string of random numbers. My seasoned eyes scanned the opening pages of the digital ledger, and a sudden wave of physical sickness washed forcefully over my entire body. The screen was filled with dozens of dummy contracts. They were multi-million-dollar agreements supposedly meant for international supply chain consulting, foreign fleet maintenance, and independent contractor logistics. The contracts spanned across phantom operations, allegedly located in South America and Eastern Europe. I recognized that none of these international vendors existed in the real world. They were ghost companies, digital mirages designed for the purpose of silently absorbing our liquid corporate capital. I clicked on the attached banking spreadsheets to follow the money trail. The offshore wire transfers listed before my eyes were staggering in their magnitude. $400,000 wired out on a Tuesday afternoon. $800,000 transferred out early on a Friday morning. The total stolen sum steadily climbed higher and higher as I scrolled down the glowing screen, eventually surpassing $12 million. $12 million bled directly from the veins of Caldwell Freight and Logistics. But the staggering magnitude of the theft itself was not the most devastating discovery. I opened the secure authorization logs attached to each of the offshore wire transfers. Every fraudulent contract, every outflow of capital bore my exact personal digital master key. Derek had used his access as the chief operating officer to bypass all the company's secondary verification and security protocols. He had brutally weaponized the complete unconditional trust I had lovingly placed in him. He had meticulously and deliberately routed the entire digital paper trail directly to the personal internet protocol address of my own home office, and specifically to this very laptop. If an aggressive external auditor or a highly trained federal investigator looked at these meticulously planted files, the fabricated narrative was undeniably perfectly clear to any outside observer. The aging, grieving founder of the company, quietly losing his grip on reality after the tragic death of his wife, was secretly looting his own empire and desperately hiding the spoils in untraceable overseas accounts. The fabricated evidence was absolutely flawless. It was a perfect, brilliantly executed, airtight frame job designed by the son I had mentored, protected, and loved unconditionally for 40 years of his life. I stared blankly at the glowing computer screen, my chest tightening painfully, with a profound, suffocating mixture of searing rage and bottomless grief. He had cold-bloodedly mapped out my federal prison sentence with the exact same ruthless precision I had personally taught him to use when mapping out complex national shipping routes. Suddenly, a sharp, abrasive buzzing sound broke the heavy silence of the guest bedroom. The cheap, prepaid burner phone resting on the nightstand vibrated aggressively against the hard surface. I snapped out of my dark thoughts, reached out my trembling hand, and picked the device up. The small, cracked digital screen illuminated the darkened room with a harsh white light. It was an encrypted text message sent from an unregistered, untraceable international number. I slowly opened the message app and read the chilling words glowing on the screen. Did the feds take the bait? My blood ran instantly cold in my veins. This was clearly not a solo operation orchestrated by my son alone. Derek was actively communicating with someone outside the house, someone closely monitoring the exact timeline of my intended downfall. Someone who knew exactly what the federal agents were supposed to find inside my wool coat. Before my mind could fully process the terrifying implications of that anonymous message, the quiet morning atmosphere was violently shattered once again. A sudden explosive, deafening crash echoed loudly from the master bedroom, located directly next door to mine. Something incredibly heavy and made of glass shattered violently against the shared drywall, sending a physical vibration through the floor. Then I heard Derek's voice piercing through the wall. He was absolutely not speaking in the calm, fake, reassuring tone he had used to comfort me down in the kitchen just moments ago. He was screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice completely unhinged, feral, and dripping with pure, desperate, uncontrollable malice. He was screaming directly at Melanie. I turned away from the mirror, dragging my booted foot across the carpet to ensure every step sounded defeated. Inside the guest bedroom, I pushed the heavy oak door shut and turned the solid brass lock with a definitive click. The moment the latch engaged, the illusion of the frail, terrified father completely vanished. I stood up straight, entirely ignoring the persistent throb radiating from my surgically repaired knee, and walked purposefully toward my leather travel bag sitting in the corner. I reached deep inside the hidden lining at the bottom of the bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. It was an extremely secure military-grade device that I specifically used for handling highly confidential corporate acquisitions, a machine designed to remain completely invisible and untraceable to the main company network. I carried the heavy device over to the small desk by the window, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and began to unstrap the thick medical boot encasing my lower leg. I ripped the heavy Velcro straps apart. Reaching deep into the dense foam padding near my ankle, I retrieved the real black USB drive and the cheap burner phone. I set the phone down on the nightstand beside the lamp. Then I held the small black drive in the center of my palm, staring at it for a long, quiet moment. This tiny piece of plastic was the weapon my own flesh and blood intended to use to bury me alive in a federal penitentiary. I plugged the drive into the side port of my laptop. The machine demanded authorization. I typed in my 30-character decryption password. The dark screen blinked twice before loading a massive series of nested financial folders. I am a man who built a nationwide logistics empire from nothing, starting with a single rusty delivery van. In the freight business, your survival dictates that you must always know exactly where every microcent of your capital goes at any given moment. You must track fuel consumption variations across thousands of miles. My brain is hardwired to spot financial anomalies, to see the invisible leaks hiding within a complex corporate structure. Derek knew this trait about me better than anyone else in the world. He knew I would eventually notice the missing capital draining from our accounts. That is exactly why he did not steal the money and run away. Instead, he constructed an elaborate alternate reality where I was the sole architect of my own company's systematic destruction. I opened the first digital folder, which was labeled with a long string of random numbers. My seasoned eyes scanned the opening pages of the digital ledger, and a sudden wave of physical sickness washed over my entire body. The screen was filled with dozens of sophisticated dummy contracts. They were multi-million-dollar agreements supposedly meant for international supply chain consulting and independent contractor logistics across phantom operations, allegedly located in South America. I recognized instantly that none of these international vendors existed in the real world. They were ghost companies, digital mirages designed for the express purpose of silently absorbing our liquid corporate capital. I clicked on the attached banking spreadsheets to eagerly follow the money trail. The offshore wire transfers listed before my eyes were absolutely staggering in their sheer magnitude. The total stolen sum steadily climbed higher and higher as I aggressively scrolled down the glowing screen, eventually surpassing $12 million. But the staggering magnitude of the theft itself was not the most devastating discovery waiting for me. I opened the secure authorization logs attached to each of the offshore wire transfers. Every single fraudulent contract, every massive outflow of capital, bore my exact personal digital master key. Derek had used his elite access as the chief operating officer to cleanly bypass all the company's secondary verification protocols. He had brutally weaponized my trust, deliberately routing the entire digital paper trail directly to the personal internet protocol address of my own home office. The fabricated evidence was absolutely flawless. It was a perfect, brilliantly executed, airtight frame job designed by the son I had loved unconditionally for 40 years. Suddenly, a sharp, abrasive buzzing sound violently broke the heavy silence of the guest bedroom. The cheap, prepaid burner phone resting on the nightstand vibrated aggressively against the hard wooden surface. I snapped out of my dark, consuming thoughts, reached out my trembling hand, and quickly picked the device up. The small, cracked digital screen illuminated the darkened room with a harsh white light. It was an encrypted text message sent from an unregistered, completely untraceable international number. I slowly opened the secure message app and read the chilling words glowing ominously on the screen. Did the feds take the bait? My blood ran instantly cold in my veins. Before my mind could fully process the terrifying implications of that anonymous text message, the quiet morning atmosphere was violently shattered once again. A sudden explosive, deafening crash echoed loudly from the master bedroom, located directly next door to mine. Something incredibly heavy and made of glass shattered violently against the shared drywall, sending a prominent physical vibration, rippling straight through the floorboards. I silently crept across the carpet and pressed my ear firmly against the cold, painted surface of the shared wall. I could hear Derek pacing furiously back and forth across the hardwood floor, his heavy footsteps echoing with frantic, unbridled rage. He was absolutely not speaking in the calm, fake, reassuring tone he had just used to comfort me down in the kitchen. He was hissing at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice completely unhinged, feral, and dripping with pure, desperate, uncontrollable malice. "The FBI just called my lawyer." Derek hissed, his words vibrating clearly through the thin plaster separating us. "They said the confiscated flash drive was completely full of old Miles Davis MP3s. Where is the real drive, Melanie? What did you do with it?" Melanie snapped back immediately, her voice shrill and trembling, with an equal measure of mounting terror and venom. "Keep your damn voice down," she shrieked. "If we do not put him securely behind bars by this Friday, the moral turpitude clause in his corporate insurance policy will not legally trigger. We absolutely need that massive $15 million payout to cover the money we lost in the Cayman crypto collapse, or the cartel brokers will kill us both." I stood frozen against the cold wall, letting the terrifying gravity of her words wash over my racing mind. They were not just greedy corporate criminals playing a harmless game of theft. They were desperate, cornered animals fighting for their literal survival against dangerous underground predators. The furious pacing in the next room completely stopped. A heavy, terrifying silence fell rapidly over the suburban house. Then I heard the undeniable sound of Derek's heavy footsteps storming fiercely down the hallway, heading directly toward my locked bedroom door with violent intent. I quickly prepared myself for the confrontation. The heavy brass handle of my bedroom door rattled so violently before the wood gave way with a sharp structural groan. The lock I had turned just moments ago was utterly useless against the sheer desperate force of a man who believed his life was entirely on the line. I immediately threw my head back against the soft pillows, forcing my facial muscles to completely relax into a mask of deep, undisturbed slumber. I let my jaw fall slightly slack, opening my mouth just enough to emit a low, rhythmic, and perfectly steady snore. I slowed my breathing, counting the seconds in my head, focusing entirely on the rhythmic rise and fall of my own chest. Through the paper-thin slits of my eyelashes, I could see the bright, harsh glare of the hallway light slice aggressively across the dark carpet, casting a long, distorted shadow into the room. Derek stepped inside, pulling the door partially shut behind him to muffle the sound. He stood perfectly still at the foot of my bed for what felt like an absolute eternity. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing, raspy and completely uneven, betraying the severe panic that had taken root deep inside his chest. My own heart was hammering fiercely against my ribs, a wild, primal drumbeat that I was certain he could hear from where he stood. He took a slow, calculated step forward, then another creeping toward my sleeping form like a predator stalking wounded prey. He leaned over me, his shadow completely blocking out the ambient light from the window. I could literally smell the stale, sour scent of cold sweat and sheer terror radiating from his expensive cologne. He hovered just inches from my face, carefully monitoring my breathing, looking for any subtle sign that I was awake and aware of his presence. I maintained the steady, low snore, completely refusing to flinch or tense my shoulders. After a grueling, agonizing moment, he finally straightened his posture and turned his attention away from the bed. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy toward the armchair in the corner of the room. I watched silently as he lunged at my heavy wool coat, his hands moving with brutal, desperate urgency. He violently shoved his hands deep into the side pockets, ripping the fabric inside out, searching frantically for the digital key that would secure his horrific $15 million insurance payout. He pulled out the black USB drive, holding it up to the faint light spilling from the hallway. I knew exactly what was racing through his mind in that precise moment. He was realizing that the drive in his hand was the very same drive the federal agents had confiscated and subsequently mocked just hours prior. He was realizing that he had absolutely no idea where the real evidence was hidden, and that his meticulously crafted plan to destroy his own father was rapidly falling apart at the seams. He let out a low, guttural hiss of pure, unadulterated frustration, dropping the useless piece of plastic back into the pocket. He tore through the inner lining of the coat, checking every hidden compartment and zippered pouch, his movements growing increasingly violent and erratic. Finding absolutely nothing to save himself from the wrath of the fictional cartel brokers he had invented to terrify his wife, he finally gave up. He threw the wool coat roughly back onto the chair, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the room. He slammed the heavy oak door shut behind him with a deafening, reverberating crash that shook the picture frames on the walls. The click of the lock echoing through the wood signaled his departure, leaving me completely alone in the suffocating darkness once again. I lay perfectly still for 5 full minutes, ensuring he was not waiting silently on the other side of the door to catch me moving. When the absolute silence of the house finally convinced me the immediate threat had passed, I sat up on the edge of the mattress. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a deep, cold, and calculated fury. The son I had raised, the boy I had loved and protected for 40 years, was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate, dangerous stranger who viewed my life and my freedom as nothing more than acceptable collateral damage. I knew unequivocally that I could not fight this battle alone. I needed a weapon that was just as ruthless and calculating as the enemies currently sleeping under my roof. I reached slowly down into the thick foam padding of my medical boot, my fingers wrapping securely around the cheap plastic casing of the prepaid burner phone. I pulled the device out and powered it on, the bright blue screen illuminating my face in the dark room. I tapped the keypad, dialing a highly confidential, unlisted number that I had memorized over 2 decades ago. I waited through 2 long, agonizing rings before the line finally clicked open. There was no greeting, no friendly hello, just the cold, expectant silence of a man who only answered this specific line for absolute emergencies. Mitchell. I whispered into the receiver, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady, ensuring no sound could bleed through the thin drywall separating me from the traitors next door. It is Harrison. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to execute my exact instructions without any hesitation. Mitchell did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply affirmed his presence, his sharp legal mind instantly prepared for war. I took a deep, steadying breath and gave the command that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my entire corporate empire. Initiate the nuclear option protocol, I instructed. It was a highly classified extreme financial failsafe we had secretly designed 10 years ago, specifically to protect the company from hostile corporate takeovers or internal sabotage. It required my direct verbal authorization and a secondary cryptographic key only Mitchell possessed. Yes, Harrison, Mitchell replied, his tone remaining perfectly stoic and professional despite the staggering gravity of the request. But you must understand the immediate consequences of this action. Executing the nuclear option will automatically trigger a massive security alert across all our banking partners within exactly 24 hours. Every financial institution holding our corporate capital will flag the sudden freeze and notify the executive board immediately. The sheer magnitude of the ticking clock settled heavily over my shoulders. I had exactly one single day to gather the rest of the damning evidence perfectly, align my strategic defenses, and prepare for the ultimate confrontation before Derek realized he had been entirely and permanently locked out of the financial empire he was desperately trying to steal. One day to dismantle a betrayal 40 years in the making. If I failed to secure the remaining digital proof before the banks contacted my son, he would use his corporate leverage to destroy everything. The countdown had officially started, and I could not afford to fail. The morning sun pierced through the thin gaps in the guest bedroom blinds, signaling the arrival of Tuesday and the absolute point of no return. I had not slept a single second. Instead, I had spent the dark hours meticulously wiping my encrypted laptop and carefully formatting a fresh, clean drive containing the devastating evidence I had compiled. I tucked the small piece of plastic into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I strapped the cumbersome medical boot back onto my leg, gripping my heavy wooden cane with white knuckles. It was time to perform the most crucial acting role of my entire existence. I slowly opened the bedroom door and limped heavily down the grand staircase, making certain every step was accompanied by a convincing groan of physical discomfort. Derek was already waiting in the massive kitchen, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, furiously typing on his smartphone. When he heard my uneven footsteps, he immediately shoved the device into his pocket and rushed to my side. He wore that same sickening mask of profound manufactured concern. He tried to gently guide me toward the plush living room sofa, insisting that I needed to sit down and rest. He told me that after the terrifying shock of the federal raid yesterday, I was in absolutely no condition to leave the safety of the house. I pulled my arm away from his grasp, leaning heavily on my cane, and allowed my voice to tremble with the stubborn, irrational pride of an aging patriarch. I told him that I had not built a nationwide logistics empire by hiding under the covers when things became difficult. I declared that the employees needed to see their founder standing strong and that I was going to my office whether he approved or not. Derek argued, his voice tightening with suppressed panic, but he could not push too hard without breaking his carefully constructed facade of the devoted protective son. He ultimately yielded, offering to drive me in his car, a hollow gesture of control I accepted to keep him completely unsuspecting. The towering glass and steel headquarters of Caldwell Freight and Logistics loomed against the gray Chicago skyline. We walked through the marble lobby side by side. I played the part of the fragile, shaken old man to absolute perfection, nodding weakly at the concerned employees who watched us pass. Derek escorted me to my executive suite on the top floor, hovering over me like a watchful hawk. I thanked him profusely for his unwavering support, my voice dripping with forced emotion, and told him to go handle the emergency board meeting. I knew he needed to stand in front of the directors and project an aura of absolute calm, spinning a brilliant web of lies to explain away the sudden federal search warrant. I watched him walk down the corridor, his shoulders squared with false confidence, completely unaware that he was stepping onto a battlefield where the landmines had already been armed. The moment his figure disappeared behind the frosted glass doors of the boardroom, I moved with sudden, fluid purpose. I locked the heavy doors of my soundproof office and closed the mechanized blinds. 5 minutes later, the private elevator chimed softly. Mitchell Thorne stepped into the room, carrying a thick leather briefcase. My ruthless corporate attorney did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed the heavy briefcase onto my polished mahogany desk and quickly began laying out the dense, complex legal documents. We were about to execute a maneuver so drastic and permanent that it defied conventional corporate logic. We were establishing an irrevocable blind trust. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair, picking up my gold fountain pen. My hand hovered over the signature lines as Mitchell explained the severe, irreversible parameters of the legal mechanism. By signing these specific documents, I was legally transferring 100% of my voting shares and the entirety of the company's liquid capital directly into the impenetrable trust. I was willingly stripping myself of all direct operational control and placing the complete financial authority of my life's work into the hands of an independent, heavily fortified legal entity. Mitchell looked me strictly in the eye, reminding me that once the final seal was applied, not even I could access the corporate funds without a lengthy, deeply scrutinized judicial review. It was an $80 million empire, built over 4 decades of blood, sweat, and relentless sacrifice, and I was holding it entirely hostage. It was a staggering, terrifying leap of faith. But as a logistics CEO who had spent 40 years charting supply chains and calculating risk, I fully understood the brutal mathematics of survival. I was deliberately signing away my empire to ensure that my own son could not drain our remaining operating funds to pay off his massive hidden debts to international cartel brokers. Derek needed that $15 million moral turpitude insurance payout to survive the deadly mess he had created in the Cayman crypto markets. He needed me safely locked away in a federal prison cell to trigger that specific clause. By freezing the assets and paralyzing the corporate structure, I was completely neutralizing his only available escape route. I was turning his brilliant, flawless trap into his own digital coffin. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the thick parchment paper. I did not hesitate. I signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes on every single page, binding my legacy in impenetrable legal iron. Mitchell gathered the signed documents with methodical efficiency. He pulled a heavy, personalized steel embosser from his briefcase. He pressed down firmly on the thick paper, locking the legal mechanism into permanent, undeniable reality. The loud metallic crunch of the seal stamping the documents echoed through the quiet, soundproof office like the definitive slam of a prison door closing. The trap was now officially and irrevocably sprung. The banks would be notified immediately. The immense wheels of the corporate failsafe were already turning, and nothing on earth could stop them. Just as Mitchell returned the heavy steel embosser to his leather briefcase, the silence of the room was abruptly shattered. The bright red light on my desk phone began to blink frantically, accompanied by a sharp, ringing tone reserved strictly for internal emergencies. I stared at the flashing red light for a brief second before reaching out and picking up the receiver. It was the chief financial officer. His voice was breathless, panicked, and entirely stripped of its usual, measured professionalism. "Sir," he stammered loudly into the receiver, his words tumbling over each other in sheer terror. All of the corporate access codes belonging to the chief operating officer were just automatically flagged and completely frozen by the primary bank. Every single one of his administrative privileges has been permanently revoked across the entire financial network. Derek is absolutely furious. He just stormed out of the executive board meeting and he is heading straight down the hallway toward your private office right now. I gently placed the receiver onto the cradle, just as heavy footsteps echoed through the outer corridor. Mitchell gave me a knowing nod swiftly, packed his briefcase, and slipped silently through the concealed door that led to the private washroom. He vanished into the shadows just a fraction of a second before the heavy frosted glass doors of my office were violently thrown open. The mahogany panel slammed against the wall stop with a deafening crack. Derek burst into the room, bringing a wave of frantic, nervous energy with him. He was completely stripped of his usual slick, polished corporate demeanor. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose and hung haphazardly around his neck. The top button of his crisp white collar was undone, and a visible sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, as if he had sprinted up all 30 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. In his right hand, he aggressively waved a thick, stapled sheaf of legal documents, the pages flapping wildly in the air. He marched directly toward my desk, bypassing the visitor chairs entirely, and slammed the heavy stack of papers down onto the polished wood right in front of me. Dad. The bank's panicked because of the FBI raid this morning. Derek hissed, his voice vibrating with a frantic, desperate urgency. He leaned his knuckles on the edge of the desk, towering over me. They saw the federal agents, they immediately flagged the active search warrant, and then they completely froze the operational accounts. Every single line of corporate credit is locked down tight. We cannot move a single cent. I need you to sign this power of attorney document right now so I can legally unfreeze the accounts and pay the delivery drivers, or we are going to lose the entire company by tomorrow morning. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting in front of me. I slowly reached into my breast pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, with deliberately trembling fingers, and placed them onto my face. I leaned forward, squinting through the lenses at the dense legal jargon printed on the top page. It took only a few seconds for my trained eyes to dissect the complex terminology. This was absolutely not a standard operational release form. This was not a temporary measure to process payroll. It was a comprehensive, ironclad, and unconditional power of attorney. If I put my signature on that specific line, I would be legally granting him absolute, unchecked control over every single one of my personal and corporate assets. It would give him the unmitigated authority to sell my corporate voting shares, liquidate my private bank accounts, and finalize the complete destruction of my empire to cover his massive offshore debts. He was trying to execute a total corporate coup under the guise of an administrative emergency. I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, burning fury that was currently raging behind my eyes. I looked up at him slowly, letting my lower lip quiver, playing the role of the overwhelmed, terrified old man to absolute perfection. "Oh, Derek," I whispered, making my voice crack with genuine-sounding fear and confusion. The banks froze everything. "That is terrible news. Are you absolutely sure this document will fix the problem? I do not understand all these complex legal words anymore. My mind is just so incredibly tired today." Derek let out an exasperated sigh, running a sweaty hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Yes, Dad, it will definitely fix everything." He snapped his patience, clearly wearing dangerously thin. "But we do not have time to sit here and read through 50 pages of standard boilerplate legal jargon. The international markets are shifting, and the vendors are threatening to walk away. You just need to trust me and sign the back page so I can fax it to the legal department immediately." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and practically shoved it into my hand. I took the pen slowly. I allowed a violent, uncontrollable tremor to take over my right hand. The silver metal tapped erratically against the polished wood of the desk. I watched Derek carefully out of the corner of my eye. He was leaning in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was staring intensely at the sharp tip of the pen, practically salivating for the dark blue ink to finally touch the crisp white paper. He was mere inches away from securing his salvation, mere seconds away from finalizing the betrayal he had been meticulously planning for months. My eyes darted toward the large ceramic mug resting on the corner of my desk. My assistant had brought it in just before Mitchell arrived, and it was still completely full of steaming, scalding hot black coffee. I let out a soft, pathetic groan, as if the sheer stress of the situation that was causing me physical pain. "I need a sip of my coffee first." Son, I mumbled weakly, my hand shaking so violently that I dropped the silver pen onto the desk. My throat is just so incredibly dry from all this terrible panic. Derek gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles clenching in visible frustration, but he did not dare stop me. I reached my trembling hand out toward the ceramic mug. I carefully wrapped my wrinkled fingers awkwardly around the thick handle. I lifted the heavy mug roughly an inch off the polished wood. Then, with a perfectly calculated and deliberate twitch of my wrist, I fumbled the grip entirely. The heavy ceramic mug tipped forward, slipping completely out of my grasp. It hit the desk with a dull thud, immediately turning over and spilling its entire contents. A massive, steaming tidal wave of scalding dark brown liquid flooded directly across the pristine legal documents. The hot coffee soaked instantly into the thick paper, turning the crisp white pages into a soggy, ruined mess. The dark blue ink of the carefully typed legal clauses immediately began to run and blur completely, destroying the complex legal language and rendering the signature lines utterly useless. The hot liquid dripped over the edge of the mahogany desk and splashed onto the expensive carpet below. I gasped loudly, recoiling in my leather chair and throwing my hands up in the air as if completely horrified by my own terrible clumsiness. "Oh, I am so clumsy today, son," I said, forcing a weak, pathetic cough into my fist. Derek stood absolutely, completely frozen. He simply stared down at the ruined documents that represented his only viable escape route. The silence became instantly suffocating. Slowly, Derek lifted his head and looked directly at me. The carefully constructed mask of the concerned protective son completely vanished. His pupils dilated, his eyes turning entirely black with a sudden murderous rage. He stared at me not as a father, but as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated physically, with zero hesitation whatsoever. He stared at me not as a father, but as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated with zero hesitation whatsoever. The venom in his eyes was unlike anything I had ever seen. He did not utter a word of protest or apology. He turned around, his breathing echoing in the quiet office, and marched straight out the glass doors, leaving the ruined coffee-soaked documents. As soon as his footsteps faded down the hallway, I locked the door and reached for the secure line to contact Mitchell. My hands were no longer shaking, with feigned weakness, but my heart was pounding with an acute awareness of the danger. We had blocked his path to the corporate treasury, but a cornered animal is always lethal. Derek was trapped, facing the destruction of his elite lifestyle and the wrath of the underground brokers he owed millions. Mitchell and I knew he was far too desperate to sit back and patiently wait for his lawyers to draft a new power of attorney. He was rapidly running out of time, and a man facing a deadline would inevitably resort to lethal measures. We needed to find out exactly where that stolen $12 million went before the Phantom Cartel forced his hand, and before he decided that a tragic accident involving his elderly father was his only remaining way out of this nightmare. I sat at my desk, pushed the ruined coffee-stained papers aside, and opened my encrypted laptop. Mitchell remained on the secure line, his rapid typing echoing softly as he connected his specialized forensic software to my machine. We could not rely on the standard corporate servers, as Derek still controlled the primary administrative access keys. However, as the original architect of the corporate infrastructure, I had personally overseen the installation of the first digital mainframe 3 decades ago. I had intentionally insisted on leaving a deeply buried analog backdoor, built directly into the foundational code of the network, a hidden pathway that bypassed the modern firewalls. It was a digital skeleton key that only I possessed. I guided Mitchell through the archaic command prompts, manually overriding the internal security protocols, until we breached the central data repository. From there, it was a matter of finding the exact access point Derek had used to synchronize his personal devices with the corporate cloud. We targeted the specific digital footprint of the burner phone I had found, hidden inside my wool coat. Derek, despite his absolute arrogance and sophisticated manipulation of the offshore wire transfers, had made a critical amateur mistake. He had linked the encrypted messaging application on the burner device to a hidden partitioned sector of the company cloud server to automatically back up his communication logs. He believed the partition was completely invisible, but under the harsh light of the foundational mainframe code, the hidden sector practically glowed. Mitchell launched an aggressive decryption algorithm to crack the partition. For 30 agonizing minutes, I sat in the soundproof office watching the string of code race across the dark screen, praying that Derek would not return with security guards to remove me. Finally, the screen flashed a solid green. The encryption cracked, opening a massive archive containing thousands of heavily coded text messages and compressed digital voice files. We began combing methodically through the dense, chaotic web of communications. The messages spanned back over 18 months, painting a horrifying picture of a man steadily losing his mind to unmitigated greed. We read frantic late-night exchanges about leveraged market positions, aggressive offshore trading strategies, and desperate pleas for extended credit lines. But as we dug deeper into the timeline, a profound inconsistency began to emerge. Mitchell, analyzing the raw transactional data embedded within the message history, suddenly paused the scrolling text. He isolated a specific block of communications, dated precisely around the time Derek claimed the catastrophic losses had occurred. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the frantic messages Derek had sent, complaining about a devastating crash in the Cayman cryptocurrency markets. He had repeatedly claimed that the severe market collapse had wiped out the stolen $12 million, leaving him entirely at the mercy of ruthless underground brokers. However, the hard digital evidence staring back at me contradicted his desperate, terrified narrative. Mitchell initiated a deep trace on the routing numbers attached to those exact financial transfers. As a logistics expert, I am accustomed to following the complex, winding path of global supply chains, tracking assets as they move from warehouses to shipping yards. The digital money trail we were observing functioned in the exact same manner. The funds had not been vaporized in a crashing crypto market. The Cayman market collapse was a calculated fabrication. The money had been systematically diverted. We watched the glowing green lines trace the $12 million as it moved rapidly through a series of tumbling algorithms bouncing across dozens of temporary accounts to obscure its destination. It was a classic digital washing machine designed to make the capital appear lost in the void of the internet. But the tumbling process eventually ended. The $12 million had settled into a highly secure secondary offshore holding shell account. It was a digital vault buried beneath layers of corporate anonymity. Derek had not lost the money to ruthless cartel brokers. The entire narrative of violent criminals hunting him down for unpaid debts was an elaborate fiction designed solely to manipulate the situation and justify the desperate need for the $15 million insurance payout. He had stolen the $12 million, hidden it away in a secondary shell, and then orchestrated a secondary crisis to steal $15 million more from the insurance policy, framing me for both events. Mitchell launched an aggressive forensic probe into the framework of that secondary holding shell. We needed to identify the exact corporate entity or the individual who held the controlling authority over that hidden $12 million. If Derek was not paying off a violent cartel who was sitting on the stolen corporate capital. The decryption software chewed through the layers of banking privacy protocols. The progress bar on the screen crawled forward at a glacial pace, stripping away the fake corporate names, proxy directors, and the trusts used to shield the owner. The silence in my office was profound, broken only by the mechanical hum of the computer processor and the sound of my shallow breathing. Finally, the last layer of digital security collapsed. The screen refreshed, displaying the unencrypted ownership documents of the holding shell. I stared at the text, illuminated in the center of the monitor, waiting for the name of an accomplice, a rival corporate raider, or even Derek himself. Instead, the name listed as the beneficiary of the $12 million struck me with the force of a blow. It was absolutely not a cartel boss. It was a name I recognized instantly, a name that made the entire puzzle snap into clear focus. The holding shell was registered entirely under the maiden name of his wife. Melanie. The name glowed on the screen, mocking me with its stark, undeniable simplicity. Melanie. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a nauseating clarity that momentarily stole the breath from my lungs. I sank back heavily into my leather chair, letting the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the betrayal wash over me. Derek was not the mastermind behind this elaborate, destructive scheme. He was the mark. He was the gullible, desperate pawn moving blindly across a chessboard that his own wife had meticulously designed. My son, with all his expensive corporate education and unearned arrogance, was nothing more than a highly useful idiot in the hands of a true apex predator. The profound irony of the situation was absolutely suffocating. I had spent the last 4 decades aggressively protecting my business from ruthless corporate raiders and hostile takeovers, entirely unaware that the most dangerous threat to my empire was sleeping in the guest room down the hall, wearing a cashmere robe purchased with my own money. As I stared at the irrefutable digital evidence proving Melanie was the sole beneficiary of the stolen $12 million, a bitter flood of memories rushed into my mind. I remembered the endless stream of lavish, exorbitant expenses I had willingly funded over the past 5 years. I remembered cheerfully signing the checks for her seemingly endless Parisian vacations, convincing myself that the breathtakingly expensive shopping sprees on the Champs-Élysées were simply the cost of keeping my son's marriage peaceful and harmonious. I remembered walking into the luxury dealership and purchasing that sleek silver $100,000 European sports car for her 30th birthday. I had watched her smile, watched her throw her arms around Derek's neck in pure, unadulterated joy. And I had genuinely believed I was buying my only son a lifetime of domestic happiness. In reality, I had been blindly funding a cold, calculating parasite. I had been subsidizing the luxurious lifestyle of a woman who was silently and methodically plotting to strip me of my legacy, my freedom, and my dignity. The sheer mechanics of her psychological manipulation were staggering to comprehend. She had expertly identified Derek's deepest insecurities, his desperate, burning need to step out from beneath my massive shadow and prove himself as a dominant corporate player. She had manipulated him into embezzling the company funds, likely whispering sweet, poisonous promises into his ear from late at night. She had undoubtedly convinced him that they were not stealing, but rather aggressively investing the capital together, building a secret fortune that would finally allow him to declare his total independence from my overbearing control. Derek, blinded by a toxic cocktail of ambition and manufactured affection, had used his elite access to bleed the company dry, believing he was securing their glorious future. But Melanie never had any intention of sharing the spoils. Once the $12 million was successfully siphoned from the corporate accounts, she had secretly funneled all the funds directly into her private, untraceable offshore holding shell. Then came her absolute masterstroke. To prevent Derek from discovering her ultimate theft, she had fabricated the devastating lie about the Cayman cryptocurrency market collapse. She had watched her husband spiral into a deep, consuming panic, and then she had ruthlessly tightened the psychological noose. She had invented the terrifying story about the violent cartel brokers, convincing Derek that ruthless, bloodthirsty criminals were actively hunting them down to collect the lost millions. The entire narrative was a brilliant, incredibly sadistic fabrication, designed specifically to keep Derek entirely terrified, deeply compliant, and desperately searching for a rapid, magical solution. She had intentionally backed him into a psychological corner, leaving him with only one viable option for survival. He had to orchestrate my tragic, immediate downfall to trigger the massive $15 million moral turpitude payout from my corporate insurance policy. Melanie was fully prepared to let my son frame me for massive federal crimes, allowing me to rot in a federal penitentiary just so she could completely double her stolen fortune and walk away without a single drop of blood on her manicured hands. Mitchell sat silently on the other end of the secure, encrypted line, waiting patiently for my command. He had seen the exact same digital ownership documents flash across his monitor. He knew exactly what this horrifying revelation meant for our rapidly shrinking timeline. We were no longer simply fighting a greedy, wildly incompetent son attempting to usurp my authority. We were actively engaging in a high-stakes war against a remorseless, highly sophisticated psychological predator who was currently living comfortably under my roof. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, my eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting focus that pushed away the mounting physical exhaustion, settling deep within my bones. I needed to know the final phase of her incredibly complex, grand design. I needed to understand exactly how she planned to orchestrate her grand exit once the insurance money was successfully secured and I was safely locked away in a concrete cell. I absolutely refused to let her win this deadly game. "Mitchell," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady despite the violent hurricane of righteous rage tearing through my chest. "I need you to completely bypass the standard administrative protocols immediately. I need you to initiate a direct, aggressive digital breach into Melanie's personal, highly encrypted email accounts. I do not care what domestic privacy laws we have to temporarily ignore to get this done. I need to see her private digital correspondence, and I need to see it right now. Find her ultimate exit strategy. Find out exactly where she plans to disappear to once this fragile house of cards finally collapses around Derek." I could clearly hear the rapid, sharp clicking of Mitchell's mechanical keyboard over the secure line as he immediately went to work, deploying a sophisticated suite of highly invasive penetration tools to brutally crack her personal firewalls. The suffocating tension inside the soundproof office was thick enough to slice with a hunting knife. For 10 agonizing, endlessly dragging minutes, I sat waiting in the heavy silence, listening only to the steady, rhythmic hum of the towering building's central ventilation system above my head. Then the horizontal progress bar on my glowing screen flashed a brilliant, triumphant green, clearly indicating a successful, undetected network breach. A massive cascade of personal emails and hidden digital files flooded rapidly onto my monitor. I quickly scanned through the most recent messages, desperately searching for international travel itineraries, foreign real estate inquiries, or offshore banking confirmations. But what I actually found hiding quietly within a deeply buried password-protected draft folder made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. It was definitely not a simple, straightforward exit strategy. It was a secondary, incredibly lethal contingency plan designed to eliminate all loose ends. And right at the very top of her neatly typed digital hit list, I saw my own name glaring back at me. Before I could fully process this sheer terrifying horror, I heard Derek's footsteps. The heavy, frantic thud of Derek's footsteps echoed violently down the hallway, heading directly toward the thick oak door of my locked guest room. I swiftly closed the encrypted laptop, shoving it deep underneath the heavy mattress, and threw myself back onto the pillows, pulling the thick cotton quilt up to my chin. The brass doorknob rattled furiously. He twisted it back and forth with a desperate, animalistic aggression, entirely forgetting the devoted son persona he had maintained just moments ago. He pounded his fist against the solid wood, demanding that I open the door immediately. I let out a loud, groggy groan, shifting my weight on the squeaking mattress to simulate a frail old man rudely awakened from a deep sleep. I called out to him, keeping my voice raspy and weak, asking what was wrong and why he was shouting. The rattling abruptly stopped. A thick, suffocating silence hung in the air for several agonizing seconds. I could practically hear the gears grinding inside his panicked mind as he realized he was dangerously close to breaking his carefully constructed character. When he finally spoke, his tone was tightly controlled, though a slight tremor of sheer terror bled through his words. He claimed he just wanted to check on me, apologizing for the loud noise, blaming it on a clumsy accident in the hallway. I told him I was fine and just wanted to rest. I listened closely as his heavy footsteps slowly retreated back down the corridor, fading into the distance. The moment the house fell completely silent once more, I pulled the encrypted laptop back out and reconnected with Mitchell over the secure line. I informed my attorney about the incredibly close call, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital hit list we had just uncovered. Mitchell had not been idle during the terrifying interruption. He had successfully bypassed the final security protocols on Melanie's private accounts and systematically downloaded her entire digital footprint. He initiated a highly secure encrypted file transfer directly to my machine. The screen briefly illuminated with a rapid succession of downloading folders. I opened the primary directory, and my eyes immediately locked onto a meticulously organized subfolder labeled with a series of vague, innocuous dates. This was her master blueprint, the ultimate architectural design for a flawless, devastating betrayal. Mitchell spoke softly through the encrypted audio channel, his usually stoic voice laced with a profound sense of utter disbelief. He told me that he had already synthesized the core documents, and that the sheer scale of her deception was unlike anything he had encountered in his entire legal career. He instructed me to open the correspondence logs spanning the last 4 months. I clicked on the first batch of intercepted emails. They were lengthy, highly detailed communications exchanged between Melanie and a notoriously aggressive, incredibly expensive international divorce attorney based out of Geneva. My hands gripped the edges of the laptop as I read her cold, calculating instructions. She was not merely planning to leave Derek. She was methodically constructing an airtight legal strategy to completely obliterate him. She had explicitly directed the attorney to draft divorce filings citing irreconcilable differences based entirely on Derek's sudden, shocking involvement in massive corporate fraud. She was proactively preparing to paint herself as the innocent, horrified wife who had suddenly discovered her husband's deep, unforgivable criminal ties. The legal documents were fully finalized, waiting only for a specific date to be formally filed with the international courts. But the divorce papers were merely the administrative aspect of her escape. I opened the next set of emails, and the true chilling reality of her timeline crystallized before my eyes. The messages were urgent communications with an elite, highly exclusive private aviation charter company. She had fully secured a long-range, untraceable private jet, paying a massive premium in untraceable digital currency to guarantee absolute discretion. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a nauseating clarity that momentarily stole the breath from my lungs. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of the betrayal washed over me, leaving me physically sick. Derek was never the mastermind behind this elaborate, destructive scheme. He was always the mark. He was the gullible, desperate pawn moving blindly across a chessboard that his own wife had meticulously designed. My son, with all his expensive corporate education and unearned arrogance, was nothing more than a highly useful idiot in the hands of a true apex predator. The profound irony of the situation was absolutely suffocating. I had spent the last 4 decades aggressively protecting my business from ruthless corporate raiders and hostile takeovers, entirely unaware that the most dangerous threat to my empire was sleeping in the guest room down the hall. I remembered the endless stream of lavish, exorbitant expenses I had willingly funded over the past 5 years. I remembered cheerfully signing the checks for her seemingly endless Parisian vacations and purchasing her a sleek silver $100,000 European sports car. I had genuinely believed I was buying my only son a lifetime of domestic happiness. In reality, I had been blindly funding a cold, calculating parasite. She had manipulated him into embezzling the money, convincing him they were investing it together. But she secretly funneled all the funds into her private offshore account. The cartel story was a brilliant fabrication she used to keep Derek completely terrified and entirely compliant. Once Derek successfully framed me and I was securely locked inside a federal prison, the company's $15 million moral turpitude insurance clause would instantly trigger. Derek would receive the massive payout, mistakenly believing he was finally safe from the fictional underground brokers. In that exact moment of his ultimate foolish triumph, Melanie would take her secretly stolen $12 million, officially file for divorce, citing his criminal family ties, and vanish completely to a non-extradition country. She would leave Derek entirely penniless, utterly alone, and desperately facing the phantom wrath of cartel ghosts that did not even exist. She had weaponized his ambition, exploited his insecurities, and expertly engineered his absolute destruction, all while sleeping calmly beside him every single night. I stared at the final confirmed flight itinerary displayed brightly on my laptop screen. The private jet charter was locked and fully fueled, The luxurious aircraft was scheduled to depart from a discreet, privately owned airstrip located just outside the city limits. She was planning to board that plane and disappear forever this Friday at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. I glanced down at the digital clock resting in the bottom corner of my screen. It was currently Thursday afternoon. The gravity of the situation pressed down heavily on my chest. I had less than 30 hours remaining to dismantle a flawless conspiracy that had been years in the making. I had less than 30 hours to spring the ultimate trap to protect my life's legacy and to deliver a devastating reckoning to the predators hiding under my roof. I closed the laptop softly. It was time to go hunting. I closed the laptop softly. It was time to go hunting. The weight of the manufactured frailty I carried for weeks vanished. I pushed back the black leather chair and stood up. For the first time since the agents stormed my estate, I did not hunch my shoulders or favor my right leg. I stood perfectly straight, extending my spine to its full commanding height. The wooden cane, my constant prop in this theater of deception, rested against the desk. I grabbed the handle, felt the polished wood under my palm, and hurled it violently across the large office. It slammed against the wall with a loud crack, splintering before clattering onto the carpet. I unfastened the medical boot from my ankle, pulling the Velcro straps apart with tearing sounds. I kicked the heavy plastic contraption aside, letting it slide under the visitor sofa where it belonged. I walked over to the tall mahogany coat rack standing by the frosted glass doors. I slipped my tailored suit jacket over my shoulders, adjusting the lapels with practiced precision. I was no longer the terrified, declining patriarch desperately clinging to a dying empire. I was the architect of my own salvation, and I was preparing to systematically dismantle the monsters who had believed they could outsmart me. Mitchell watched my physical transformation with a look of silent approval. He knew exactly what this shift in posture signified. The defensive maneuvers were officially concluded. We were transitioning into an active, lethal, offensive strategy. I walked back to my desk and picked up the secure landline, holding it out toward my attorney. "Mitchell," I said, my voice resonating with absolute authority. "I need you to contact the federal authorities immediately. Demand a direct channel to the FBI agents who executed the search warrant yesterday. Tell them that the Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Freight and Logistics is requesting an immediate, highly classified meeting at a neutral, secure location. Inform them that I have successfully acquired the digital documentation they were searching for during their raid, and that I am completely prepared to deliver the architects of this financial conspiracy directly into their hands." Mitchell did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He took the receiver from my hand, his fingers dancing rapidly across the numerical keypad as he dialed a direct, unlisted number for the federal field office. While he established the secure connection and began negotiating the strict parameters of our surrender, I gathered the weapons of their destruction. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out the fresh USB drive containing the devastating offshore banking records, the undeniable proof of the stolen $12 million, and the catastrophic digital trail leading directly to the secondary holding shell registered in Melanie's maiden name. I placed the small plastic rectangle carefully into a secure evidence bag. Next, I retrieved the plastic burner phone from the inner lining of my medical boot, the very device Derek believed he had hidden perfectly. I powered the device down, ensuring its battery would remain stable, and placed it into a second evidence bag. Finally, I took the thick, freshly printed stack of decrypted emails Mitchell had intercepted from Melanie's highly secure cloud partition. I aligned the edges of the crisp paper, staring down at her chilling correspondence with the divorce attorneys and the private aviation charter company. Her entire flawlessly evil exit strategy was documented in stark black and white ink, a damning testament to her absolute lack of human empathy. I slid the thick stack of papers into a heavy manila envelope, sealing the clasp tight. Mitchell covered the receiver with his hand, looking at me with intense, focused eyes. "The lead agents have agreed to the meeting," he whispered, his tone sharp and strictly professional. "They are securing a private conference room at a federal facility just outside the city center. We have exactly 1 hour to arrive. I nodded, slipping the evidence bags and the thick manila envelope into Mitchell's heavy leather briefcase. When we arrived at the bleak concrete federal building, the atmosphere was thick with intense suspicion. Two senior FBI agents, the same individuals who had interrogated me in my own living room just 48 hours prior, sat across from us at a cold table. I did not wait for their standard interrogation tactics. I immediately took control of the narrative. I laid the USB drive, the burner phone, and the manila envelope onto the center of the table. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead agent and outlined my absolute non-negotiable terms. I offered them the entire unmitigated truth behind the $15 million corporate embezzlement scheme. I offered them the precise digital location of the stolen funds, the holding shells, and the irrefutable proof of domestic wire fraud. In exchange, Mitchell formally presented our demand for absolute sweeping and unconditional federal immunity for myself and my corporate entity. I was handing them the true perpetrators on a gleaming silver platter, completely gift-wrapped with undeniable forensic evidence. After 3 grueling hours of intense negotiation, verifying the evidence and frantic calls to federal prosecutors, the binding immunity agreement was signed and sealed. With my freedom entirely secured and the federal net rapidly tightening around my son and his vicious wife, I returned to my executive office to cast the final deadly bait. I sat at my terminal, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I opened the primary corporate communication portal and drafted a company-wide, highly classified, and incredibly urgent internal memorandum. I flagged the document with the highest possible priority markers to bypass all administrative filters. The subject line was stark and incredibly uncompromising. Emergency Board of Directors meeting. I set the precise date and time for Friday afternoon at exactly 4 sharp. Attendance was strictly mandatory for the Chief Operating Officer, Derek Caldwell, and the Vice President of Marketing, Melanie Caldwell. In the brief, carefully calculated body of the email, I outlined the sole definitive agenda for the emergency gathering. It was the formal announcement of the Chief Executive Officer's immediate resignation and the complete unconditional transfer of corporate power. I pressed the send button, watching the confirmation flash across the monitor as the message shot through the network. I sat back, staring at the screen, waiting for the inevitable reaction. I did not have to wait long. Less than 30 seconds after the urgent memorandum was dispatched, a sharp notification echoed through the office. A direct reply from Derek materialized in my primary inbox. I clicked the message open, my eyes scanning the brief, predictable response. "I will be there, Dad. It is for the best." I stared at his words, a cold feeling settling in my own stomach. He genuinely thought he had finally won the long war. He believed his brutal, desperate tactics had successfully broken my spirit and forced my surrender. He was marching blindly forward, completely confident in his fabricated victory, entirely unaware he was walking straight into the slaughterhouse. The heavy hands of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the executive boardroom ticked forward with methodical, unforgiving precision. It was exactly 3:55 on Friday afternoon. I sat completely motionless at the head of the massive custom-built mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. The polished surface stretched out before me, reflecting the gray light bleeding through the windows that overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline. For nearly 30 years, this specific room had served as the undisputed nerve center of my entire logistics empire. It was the hallowed ground where I had negotiated acquisitions, outmaneuvered rivals, and systematically built a legacy intended to last for generations. Today, however, it would serve a vastly different purpose. It was no longer a place of corporate governance. It had been meticulously transformed into an inescapable digital execution chamber. I rested my hands flat against the cool wood, feeling the steady rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat echoing in my fingertips. I had spent the entire morning finalizing the logistical parameters of the federal trap, ensuring that every single digital tripwire was perfectly aligned and securely fastened. The sheer magnitude of the impending confrontation hung in the sterile air-conditioned air, thick and heavy with unspoken finality. I stared at the double frosted glass doors at the far end of the room, waiting for the arrival of the two individuals who had foolishly believed they could dismantle my life without consequence. Precisely 2 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open with an arrogant, sweeping flourish. Derek and Melanie walked into the boardroom moving perfectly in sync, projecting the undeniable aura of conquering royalty arriving to claim their rightful throne. Derek wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that practically screamed corporate dominance. His chin held high, his shoulders squared with a profound overconfidence. He believed he was merely minutes away from forcing my signature onto a resignation letter, securing his ultimate control over the company and paving the way for his $15 million insurance payout. But it was Melanie who truly captured my undivided cold attention. She walked beside him radiating an entirely manufactured grace. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored cream pantsuit, looking every inch the devoted, supportive corporate wife. Slung casually over her left shoulder was an oversized, incredibly expensive designer travel bag. To the untrained eye, it might have simply looked like a luxurious accessory, but I knew exactly what that bag represented. I knew that nestled inside the Italian leather was her passport, her encrypted digital hardware, and the untraceable offshore banking credentials holding $12 million of my stolen capital. I knew that she was already packed and entirely prepared to board a private jet at 8 o'clock tonight, completely ready to abandon the foolish, desperate man walking proudly beside her. They moved gracefully toward the center of the room, their expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the pristine hardwood floor. I remained perfectly still, keeping my facial features entirely slack, maintaining the pathetic illusion of a defeated old man who had surrendered to the crushing weight of a federal investigation. I watched as Melanie reached out and gently placed a reassuring hand on Derek's lower back, a brilliant, subtle performance of spousal solidarity. The sheer depth of her psychological manipulation was staggering to witness in person. She was actively guiding him toward his own spectacular destruction, smiling warmly while silently counting down the hours until she could vanish into the sky, leaving him to face the devastating, catastrophic fallout completely alone. Derek pulled out one of the heavy leather executive chairs for her, playing the part of the attentive gentleman before moving to take the seat directly to my right. As they settled into their respective chairs, the overwhelming emptiness of the massive boardroom finally began to register in Derek's eyes. He looked up and down the length of the long mahogany table, noting the 20 empty leather chairs that should have been occupied by the senior directors and vice presidents of the company. A brief fleeting shadow of confusion crossed his perfectly groomed features. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. Melanie, too, seemed to sense a slight shift in the atmosphere. She sat perfectly upright, her posture rigid, her sharp eyes darting toward the frosted glass doors, as if expecting the rest of the board to materialize from the hallway. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out between us, allowing their internal anxiety to slowly build. I wanted them to fully experience the unsettling, creeping realization that the carefully scripted narrative they had prepared was beginning to unravel. Derek cleared his throat loudly, leaning forward and resting his forearms against the polished wood of the table. He looked at me, slipping back into his practiced persona of profound concern. "Where is the board, Dad?" he asked, his voice dripping with a manufactured sympathy that made my stomach churn. He gestured broadly toward the long row of empty chairs. "Did they abandon you because of the FBI probe? It is perfectly understandable if they wanted to distance themselves from the current legal situation. You do not have to face this terrible humiliation alone. I am here for you, and we can handle the transition of power quietly and respectfully." Melanie immediately chimed in, her voice soft and utterly lethal. "We just want what is best for you, Robert," she murmured, offering me a fake smile. "You have worked so incredibly hard for so many years. It is finally time for you to rest and let Derek carry this heavy burden." You do not need to worry about the federal agents or the banks anymore. We are going to take care of absolutely everything from now on. I listened to their poisonous lies, feeling a cold clarity wash over my entire being. The time for deception was officially over. The final curtain was falling on their elaborate, sadistic theater production. I did not say a single word. I simply reached my right hand slowly underneath the thick lip of the mahogany desk. My fingers brushed against the concealed security panel I had installed years ago for executive lockdowns. I found the primary switch and pressed it firmly. A heavy electronic click echoed violently through the room as the magnetic locks on the double frosted glass doors instantly engaged, sealing the room tight. The sudden noise caused Melanie to flinch visibly, her hands dropping quickly from the table. Derek sat back in his chair, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I placed my hands flat on the desk and pushed myself upright. I did not groan. I did not tremble. I dropped the frail facade, completely extending my spine to its full commanding height, allowing my voice to resonate with the absolute authority of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. "They aren't coming, Derek," I said, my tone as cold and unforgiving as solid steel. "But we do have some special guests." The oak paneling of the secondary executive entrance groaned softly as the magnetic security seals disengaged. The side door of the boardroom opened with a slow, deliberate swing that commanded absolute attention. Mitchell Thorne stepped onto the dark carpet, his posture rigid and his expression carved from unyielding granite. He carried his signature leather briefcase, but he was not arriving as a simple corporate attorney today. He was the definitive herald of absolute ruin. Immediately behind him stepped two heavily armed federal agents moving with highly synchronized tactical efficiency. They were the exact same FBI operatives who had torn through my private estate just 48 hours prior. Their dark suits, holstered weapons, and cold glares instantly sucked all the oxygen straight out of the massive room. The atmosphere shifted from tense corporate anxiety to explosive visceral dread in a fraction of a second. Derek jumped out of his luxurious chair, pushing backward with such sudden force that the heavy seat slammed against the glass wall behind him. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ghostly pale. He stood frozen, his chest heaving, his panicked eyes darting wildly between the armed federal agents, the locked doors, and my stoic form sitting at the head of the mahogany table. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, pathetic, and terrified rasp emerged from his throat. I did not even grant the federal agents a passing glance. My cold gaze remained locked entirely on the trembling figure of my only son. I let the suffocating silence stretch across the room intentionally, allowing the crushing weight of his impending doom to compress his lungs. "You sold me out for a cartel debt, Derek," I asked, my voice eerily calm, cutting sharply through the thick air of the corporate boardroom. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a small presentation remote. I held it up, letting the polished plastic catch the dim light bleeding through the large windows. Without breaking eye contact with the desperate man who had tried to destroy my existence, I pressed the primary button. The mechanized hum of the massive projector screen descending slowly from the ceiling filled the quiet room. The heavy white canvas unrolled smoothly, blanketing the far wall in a stark square of pure anticipation. The high-definition projector mounted above my head flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow directly across the polished wood of the table. The screen illuminated brightly with a dizzying, complex array of decrypted offshore bank statements, dense international routing numbers, and cascading transactional logs. I watched Derek stare blankly at the glowing numbers, his brow furrowing in profound confusion, as his panicked brain struggled to comprehend the raw financial data displayed before him. He was frantically searching the screen for the terrifying, bloodthirsty international brokers he genuinely believed he owed his life to. But the detailed ledgers told an entirely different, devastating story. "There is no cartel, you complete and utter idiot," I stated loudly, the undeniable truth echoing brutally off the frosted glass walls of the executive chamber. I pressed the secondary button on my remote, activating a bright green laser pointer. I guided the vibrant green dot smoothly across the screen, deliberately tracing the exact flow of the $12 million he had so arrogantly siphoned from the corporate operational funds. I showed him the tumbling digital algorithms, the dizzying maze of temporary holding accounts, and the complex digital washing machine designed specifically to obscure the final destination of his unforgivable theft. I watched his terrified eyes follow the green light, the creeping, horrifying realization beginning to violently fracture his constructed reality. You genuinely believed you were embezzling my life's work simply to save your own skin from highly dangerous criminals. I continued, my voice steady, relentless, and completely devoid of any remaining paternal warmth. You actually thought those terrifying encrypted messages and those aggressive demands for immediate capital were originating from some ruthless, shadowy international syndicate. I moved the bright green laser down to the bottom right corner of the projected spreadsheet, carefully highlighting the ultimate heavily guarded digital vault where the tumbling process finally ended. Your own wife secretly stole the $12 million you so aggressively and foolishly embezzled from my company. It is not lost in a sudden cryptocurrency market collapse. It is currently sitting securely in a highly fortified, fully encrypted account in Belize, registered exclusively and entirely under her maiden name. Derek stood paralyzed, his jaw hanging slightly open as the catastrophic weight of my words slammed into his chest. I did not stop to let him breathe. I pressed the black remote once again, cycling the projector to the next slide. The screen immediately filled with the intercepted, highly confidential and deeply damning emails between Melanie and the elite, wildly expensive divorce attorneys located in Geneva. I forced him to read the chilling, calculating correspondence where she meticulously laid out her flawless legal strategy to completely abandon him. She had explicitly and repeatedly directed them to draft the divorce filings, citing his sudden, shocking involvement in massive corporate fraud and money laundering. I cycled rapidly to the final, most devastating slide displaying the confirmed, fully paid itinerary for the private aviation charter. She was proactively preparing to paint herself to the entire world as the innocent, horrified, and deeply traumatized spouse, I explained, driving the final lethal nail into his psychological coffin. Once you successfully framed me and I was sent to permanently rot in a federal prison cell, the company's $15 million insurance policy would automatically and irreversibly trigger. You would receive the massive payout, mistakenly believing you were finally completely safe. And in that exact triumphant moment, Melanie fully planned to take her secretly stolen $12 million file for an immediate divorce and vanish completely to a non-extradition country on a private jet scheduled to depart tomorrow night. She was going to leave you absolutely penniless, entirely alone, and desperately facing the phantom wrath of violent cartel ghosts that never even existed in the first place. The devastating sudden realization finally hit Derek like a massive runaway freight train. His entire body trembled violently as the grand fabricated illusion of his entire life shattered instantly into a million sharp, jagged pieces. He slowly, mechanically turned his heavy head to look directly at Melanie. The smug, deeply superior, and incredibly confident smile that had been plastered across her flawless face since she first walked into the boardroom completely evaporated. Her pristine, entirely false mask of the devoted, supportive corporate wife shattered instantly into absolute nothingness. The blood rushed from her cheeks, leaving her looking incredibly hollow, exposed, and deeply terrified. The absolute certainty of her flawless, meticulously planned escape route had been entirely brutally dismantled in a matter of mere minutes. As Derek stared at the woman he had betrayed his own father for her false composure, crumbled completely, replaced rapidly by sheer, primal, and animalistic panic. The suffocating tension inside the executive boardroom finally snapped with the explosive force of a bomb. The absolute certainty of Melanie's flawless escape route had been brutally dismantled in a matter of mere minutes, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Derek stared at the woman he had married, the woman for whom he had betrayed his own flesh and blood, his chest heaving with sharp, ragged breaths. The realization that he was nothing more than a disposable asset struck him with a physical force. A guttural, animalistic roar tore from his throat, a sound completely stripped of his usual polished corporate sophistication. "You lied to me!" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging, as his face flushed a deep, furious crimson. "You made me frame my own father for absolutely nothing." He lunged across the heavy mahogany table, his hands reaching out with pure violence, desperate to wrap his fingers around her throat. Melanie shrieked, scrambling backward in her luxurious leather chair, her pristine cream pantsuit wrinkling as she tried to evade his sudden, terrifying assault. She threw her arms up to shield her face, the designer travel bag slipping from her shoulder and crashing heavily onto the floor, spilling a collection of international currency and a dark blue passport onto the dark carpet. Before Derek could even make physical contact, the two federal agents positioned near the doorway moved with breathtaking speed and tactical precision. They intercepted my furious son with absolute force. One agent grabbed Derek by the shoulders, violently yanking him backward, while the other secured his flailing arms, pinning them tightly behind his back. Derek struggled wildly against their iron grip, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the base of the table, his eyes remaining locked on his terrified wife. He was completely unhinged, a man who had literally burned his entire world to ashes for a phantom promise that never actually existed. The lead agent barked a sharp command warning Derek that any further aggression would result in immediate physical restraint. Derek finally stopped struggling, collapsing heavily against the strong grip of the agents, his chest rising and falling as he gasped for air. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, foolish man who had finally realized the staggering depth of his own catastrophic stupidity. I stood perfectly still at the head of the long table, leaning slightly against the polished wood, watching the spectacular, humiliating implosion of their toxic alliance with a cold, unwavering detachment. I felt absolutely no pity for him. He had made his choices, and now he was choking on the bitter, poisonous fruit of his own arrogant harvest. I kept my gaze firmly fixed on my son, refusing to let him look away from the devastating reality I was systematically dismantling before his eyes. I raised the small black remote in my right hand and pressed the forward button one more time. The massive projector screen behind me flashed instantly, displaying the highly confidential, undeniable proof of Melanie's ultimate exit strategy. Bright, undeniable images filled the canvas. The confirmed private jet itinerary, the exorbitant digital wire transfers paying for the untraceable aircraft, and the meticulously drafted, incredibly detailed emails exchanged with the elite international divorce attorneys. Derek stared at the glowing screen, his jaw hanging slack, his eyes widening as he read the legal terminology, demanding a complete dissolution of their marriage based entirely on his criminal activities. "She was not just stealing the money," Derek stated, my voice echoing through the quiet boardroom with the heavy, inescapable weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. I pointed directly at the brightly illuminated flight schedule on the white screen. "She was going to let you take the fall with me, drain the massive insurance money, and then completely leave you holding the bag while she flew to a private, sunny beach on another continent. She used your ambition as a weapon, she fed your pathetic insecurities, and she orchestrated this entire financial massacre so she could walk away a multimillionaire while you rotted in a concrete federal prison cell. She was never your partner's son. You were just her most convenient victim." The crushing finality of my words seemed to physically drain the remaining life from his body. His knees buckled slightly, and the federal agents had to adjust their grip to keep him standing upright. He looked at Melanie not with anger anymore, but with a profound, hollow emptiness, finally recognizing the monstrous predator hiding behind the beautiful face he thought he loved. Melanie, however, was far too cunning and far too ruthless to simply surrender. As the undeniable magnitude of her exposure settled into the room, her sheer animalistic panic immediately transformed into a deeply calculated, desperate performance. She realized instantly that the brilliant deception was entirely over, and she immediately pivoted to her only remaining strategy. She fell to her knees on the dark carpet, clutching her chest, and began to sob uncontrollably. Large, perfectly formed tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked up at the two stern federal agents, her voice trembling with a masterfully feigned, deeply profound terror. "He forced me," she cried out, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at her stunned husband. "Derek abused me for years. He threatened my life. He forced me to set up those offshore accounts. I was only transferring the stolen corporate money to protect it from him, to keep it safe until I could find a way to escape his violent control. You have to believe me. He is a monster, and I was just trying to survive his terrible, suffocating cruelty." The sheer audacity of her performance was genuinely breathtaking. Even in the face of absolute, irrefutable digital evidence, she was seamlessly attempting to manipulate the federal authorities, casting herself as the tragic, battered wife fleeing a tyrannical husband. Derek simply stared at her, completely speechless, utterly paralyzed by the staggering depth of her immediate, effortless betrayal. He could not even muster the energy to deny her vicious allegations. The federal agents exchanged a brief glance, completely unmoved by her theatrical display. They easily recognized a cornered predator attempting to spin a final web of lies. Before she could continue her fabricated narrative of victimhood, Mitchell Thorne stepped forward from the shadows near the side door. The seasoned corporate attorney moved with a calm, deliberate authority. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the sealed plastic rested the cheap burner phone I had successfully extracted from Derek's coat pocket. Mitchell held the bag up to the bright fluorescent lights, ensuring everyone in the room could see it clearly. He did not raise his voice, but his words sliced through Melanie's fake sobbing with lethal precision. "We have the complete audio files recovered directly from this specific device," Mitchell stated, handing the sealed evidence bag to the lead federal agent. "These files prove she orchestrated the entire frame-up." The heavy silence that followed Mitchell Thorne's declaration was absolute. The seasoned attorney stood tall, holding the evidence bag, containing the plastic burner phone, like a sacred artifact. The lead federal agent took the sealed package, his stern eyes never leaving Melanie's crumbling face. The reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her monumental arrogance. She stared at the small electronic device with wide eyes, her breath catching painfully. The carefully constructed narrative of the victimized wife evaporated instantly into the sterile boardroom air. She knew exactly what audio recordings Mitchell was referencing. She knew they contained every calculating whisper she had spoken in the dark, every explicit instruction she had given Derek to forge my signature, and every venomous laugh they shared while plotting my ultimate destruction. The staggering weight of a federal indictment, carrying the undeniable promise of decades behind reinforced steel bars, descended upon her shoulders. She opened her mouth to mount another desperate defense, to weave another elaborate lie, but her voice completely failed her. The suffocating dread of impending incarceration choked the words before they could even form. She looked wildly around the massive executive chamber, seeking a sympathetic face, but found only the cold, unyielding stares of men who had dismantled her malicious empire. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his posture rigid. He signaled to his partner with a subtle nod, initiating the final phase of their tactical operation. "Melanie Caldwell," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he recited the devastating words of the Miranda warning, the second agent moved swiftly behind her. He grabbed her wrists, pulling her arms firmly behind her back. Melanie flinched, letting out a sharp gasp as the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around her wrists. The harsh metallic click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply against the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. To my ears, that sharp mechanical sound was the sweetest symphony I had heard in 5 long years. It was the definitive sound of absolute justice, the undeniable validation of my grueling fight for vindication. The agent secured the restraints tightly. She twisted her shoulders, attempting to pull away, but the operative held her firmly in place. Her designer travel bag remained abandoned on the dark carpet, a pathetic reminder of her monumental failure. "You have the right to an attorney." The lead agent continued his cadence, relentless. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" She refused to answer, her jaw clenched tight with terror and impotent rage. Derek watched the physical process of his wife being bound in steel restraints with a look of pure horror. The commanding reality of the federal agents operating within the walls of our corporate headquarters finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. He looked at the lead agent, then down at his own trembling hands, before turning his frantic gaze toward me. The false bravado and the cruel superiority he had wielded for months were completely gone. He was nothing more than a terrified, broken child facing the catastrophic consequences of his monumental greed. The lead agent turned his attention from Melanie and stepped directly toward my son. "Derek Caldwell," he began, raising a pair of heavy silver handcuffs. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy and federal wire fraud." The words struck Derek with the force of a physical blow. His knees buckled instantly, unable to support the sudden weight of his impending doom. He collapsed heavily onto the dark carpet, falling directly to his knees in front of my mahogany desk. He threw his hands out, his eyes wide and completely desperate, tears streaming freely down his pale cheeks. He was weeping uncontrollably, his chest heaving with loud, ragged sobs that filled the quiet room. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic desperation. "I am your son. Please do not let them take me. I will do anything. I will fix all of this. I will give everything back. Just tell them to stop, please, Dad." I remained standing behind the expansive surface of the executive desk, looking down at the weeping figure on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No lingering trace of paternal affection, no familiar pang of familial duty, and absolutely no sympathy for his profound suffering. The man crying on the carpet was a complete stranger, a venomous parasite who had eagerly attempted to bury me alive simply to fuel his own pathetic ambition. I walked slowly around the edge of the heavy wooden table, my footsteps silent against the soft flooring. I stopped merely 2 feet away from where he knelt. I looked down at the pathetic shell of a man, my face carved from unyielding stone, my expression completely devoid of any remaining warmth or mercy. I let him look up into my eyes, forcing him to witness the terrifying emptiness reflecting back at him. "You stopped being my son the moment you slipped that encrypted USB drive into my suit coat." I stated, my voice low, dangerously calm, and entirely devoid of any forgiveness. "You chose to frame your own flesh and blood. You eagerly dug a grave for me, and now you are going to be forced to lie in it." I stared straight into his weeping, terrified eyes, delivering my final, devastating judgment. "Enjoy the cell, Derek." The words struck him with lethal precision, instantly severing the very last invisible thread that had ever connected us. He dropped his head into his hands, his loud, agonizing sobs echoing miserably across the large room. The federal agents did not hesitate to complete their designated task. They hauled Derek forcefully to his feet, securing his wrists tightly behind his back with a second pair of heavy metal handcuffs. The sharp, mechanical clicking sound repeated, sealing his miserable fate. As the operatives began to march the 2 traitors forcefully toward the heavy boardroom doors, Melanie completely lost her remaining shred of composure. She twisted wildly against the tight grip of the federal agent, her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. She screamed vile, breathless obscenities at me, her shrill voice echoing violently through the executive chamber as they dragged her unceremoniously out into the hallway. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, instantly cutting off her frantic, desperate screaming. The room fell into a deep, profound silence, leaving only Mitchell Thorne and myself standing in the wake of the total destruction. I turned slowly away from the wooden table and walked over to the towering floor to ceiling windows. I stood quietly by the glass looking out over the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. The entire toxic weight completely lifted off my shoulders. 2 weeks later, the thick, suffocating dust from their spectacular implosion finally settled across the cold concrete of the federal justice system. Derek and Melanie were both formally denied bail by a thoroughly unamused federal judge who viewed their extensive flight risk and offshore financial entanglements as insurmountable red flags. They are currently sitting in separate, heavily guarded federal detention facilities, desperately facing a minimum of 20 years for conspiracy, international wire fraud, and massive corporate embezzlement. The brilliant, airtight divorce papers Melanie had so meticulously prepared in Geneva are now entirely worthless, completely invalidated by the undeniable fact that her own criminal conspiracy was the foundational catalyst for their mutual destruction. She is no longer the wealthy, independent victim she envisioned. She is simply a federal inmate waiting for a trial she cannot possibly win. The profound silence in my sprawling house is no longer a source of sorrow. It is a canvas of absolute peace. I officially dissolved the blind trust that had shielded my assets and decisively took full, unmitigated control of Caldwell Logistics once again. Walking back onto the main executive floor felt like breathing pure oxygen after years of breathing toxic smoke. I immediately initiated a massive sweeping purge of the corporate hierarchy. I cleared out the entire executive suite systematically, terminating every single vice president and director who had blindly enabled Derek's reckless, destructive behavior. In their place, I promoted the loyal, hardworking floor managers, the men and women who actually bleed for this company, who understand the heavy machinery, the late nights, and the grueling physical reality of the logistics industry. The sheer scale of the legal reckoning they faced was unprecedented. The federal prosecutors meticulously unpacked their labyrinthine financial network, eagerly seizing every single asset tied to the illicit $12 million. The luxurious estate they had planned to purchase, the expensive vehicles they drove, and the offshore accounts Melanie had so carefully encrypted were all systematically frozen and confiscated. Their high-priced defense attorneys, initially confident and aggressive, quickly retreated into silence once the full weight of the intercepted audio recordings and digital ledgers was presented during the preliminary hearings. There were no plea deals offered. The government intended to make a highly visible example of their corporate malfeasance. Derek and Melanie were completely isolated, turning violently against one another in a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure leniency. Their courtroom appearances became a chaotic spectacle of mutual recrimination, each desperately trying to shift the ultimate blame onto the other. It was a tragic, ugly end to a partnership built entirely on a foundation of boundless greed and mutual manipulation. They had constructed a flawless digital trap only to find themselves permanently locked inside it. The process of healing the corporate entity required an equally ruthless approach. I spent weeks personally interviewing the individuals I promoted, ensuring that the new leadership team shared my unyielding commitment to operational integrity. We instituted rigorous, multi-layered financial auditing protocols, completely eliminating the systemic vulnerabilities Derek had so easily exploited. The board of directors, thoroughly shaken by the sheer proximity of the crisis, granted me sweeping emergency powers to restructure the entire corporate governance framework. The company emerged from the crisis leaner, significantly stronger, and completely vaccinated against the toxic rot of unchecked nepotism. I realized that my previous failure was rooted in a blind, unquestioning assumption of familial loyalty. I had given Derek the keys to the kingdom simply because he carried my name, completely ignoring the fundamental lack of character that defined his existence. That mistake would never be repeated. The future of Caldwell Logistics would be determined by genuine merit, undeniable loyalty, and a proven track record of ethical conduct. My legacy would no longer be tied to a treacherous bloodline. It would be entirely defined by the thousands of honest employees who relied on this company to feed their families and build their own futures. With the corporate empire stabilized and thriving under genuine dedicated leadership, I turned my focused attention toward my personal legacy. I sat down with Mitchell Thorne in his quiet wood-paneled office and completely tore apart my existing estate planning documents. I ordered him to draft a revolutionary framework I called the Character Clause, a strict legal mandate ensuring that not a single cent of my accumulated wealth would ever fall into the greedy, undeserving hands of my treacherous bloodline. I completely rewrote my last will and testament, liquidating my massive, pristine Montana estate to explicitly execute the redirection of that inheritance directly to a cutting-edge children's hospital. The remaining bulk of my vast corporate estate is now irrevocably pledged to a newly established trade school foundation dedicated to underprivileged youth. They will learn real skills, build real lives, and understand the profound value of honest labor. Blood means absolutely nothing without loyalty, respect, and fundamental human decency. The local media aggressively chased the scandal for days, splashing their disgraced faces across the morning papers and nightly news broadcasts. They dubbed the entire sordid affair "The Ashes of Greed," a surprisingly fitting title for a conspiracy that burned two ambitious predators to the ground while leaving the intended victim standing completely untouched. I completely ignored the reporters, the frantic phone calls from distant relatives, and the pathetic whining letters Derek managed to send from his bleak concrete cell. I instructed my legal team to return all his correspondence unopened and clearly marked as refused. He made his terrible choices, and now he must learn to live within the claustrophobic confines of his newly constructed reality. As I sit in my newly renovated executive office, surrounded by the hum of a thriving, honest business, I feel a profound sense of rejuvenation. The heavy, dark storm clouds that gathered over my life for the past 5 years have finally scattered. I walk slowly over to the mahogany coat rack standing proudly in the corner of the room. I reach out and gently touch the fabric of my old dark wool coat. It is the exact same coat Derek slipped the encrypted flash drive into the very garment they gleefully tried to use as the primary instrument of my complete destruction. I did not throw it away. I hung it prominently in my office, directly in my daily line of sight. It serves as a powerful, permanent, and daily reminder that a king must never sleep even when he closes his eyes. It reminds me that trust is a fragile, easily corrupted currency, and that vigilance is the ultimate price of sustained success. I slowly pour myself a very small glass of aged bourbon, the amber liquid catching the bright afternoon light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I raise the heavy glass to the sprawling, vibrant Chicago skyline, offering a silent, solitary toast to the painful but necessary brutal truth. The long war is now definitively over. The rightful architect remains proudly standing. The entire empire is entirely safe, securely guarded against the monstrous predators hiding deep within the dark shadows. True wealth is absolutely never measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the integrity with which you live your life. Greed is a blinding poison that makes people recklessly destroy the very hands that feed them. We often believe that blood ties guarantee loyalty, but family is a title that must be earned every single day through respect and honesty. Never let your guard down simply because someone shares your own last name. In the end, the truth almost always rises to the surface, and those who dig graves for others inevitably end up burying themselves permanently. If this powerful story opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe today so you never miss another profound truth. Have you ever experienced deep betrayal from someone you trusted so completely? Tell me your personal story in the comments below, and please let me know your city today.